Hello, I'm Mark McSherry from Virtual School Victoria, and I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Welcome. This is the second in a series of 3 composing workshops that have been presented, or that are being presented via a partnership between Virtual School Victoria and the Melbourne Recital Centre. This is now supported by the Victorian Department of Education's Strategic Partnership Program, as well as the Hugh Williamson Foundation. Today, we'll be drilling down into what it means to compose for and perform in an established music ensemble. The string quartet has been with us for over 250 years, and as you'll hear a little later, lots of new music is still being written for this combination of 2 violins, a viola and a cello. And we are privileged to have one of the world's finest quartets with us today, the Flinders Quartet, and we'll do the personal introductions of all the players in a minute. But here's what we will be doing. We'll start with music from around 1797 and then have a brief discussion about its arrangement and the roles of the instruments in a work from the classical era. And then my colleague Dr. Tim Dargaville will lead a discussion with the quartet through some very different compositional approaches by dissecting a piece by Australian composer Anne Cause, which actually was premiered about a week ago. And of course, we'll hear the second live performance of that work today. And finally, Tim will then engage in a creative exchange with the quartet using one of his own pieces. It's the concepts behind it and his approach to writing for the ensemble. And if we still have some time at the end, we can take some questions from our live audience here in the Primrose Potter Salon at the MRC. So let's get to the music, and we'll step back to Europe, 1797, and it's a work by Joseph Haydn, who is sometimes referred to as the father of the string quartet. This is the Flinders Quartet, playing the first movement of Haydn's String Quartet, Opus 20, number 6. the Flinders Quartet, and let's introduce these wonderful, wonderful people on violin. We have Thibaut Pavlovich-Hobber. Second violin is Jenny Kafagi. Viola, Tom Hyam. And cello, Zoe Knighton. Let's do that again. So that was a work from Haydn, as I said, from 1797, and it seems to me to be the epitome of the classical style. You hear very strong melodic lines, there are kind of balanced ideas, there is a clarity in the writing, lots of question and answer there, and if you're listening, there's a lot of modulation there. It goes some very strange places in that one. It's almost like a classical or a classic textural arrangement of sounds. Most of the focus is given to first violin, and a lot of the time the other three instruments are actually supporting it. Is that how you see it? And what does that mean when you come to a work like this?
Yeah, definitely. I think, especially in Haydn era sort of music, the first violin is obviously the most important voice, playing all the melodies most of the time.
How do you feel about it?
Yeah. It's great, and yeah, usually has the most to do as well. And then the cello obviously is providing the bass, and then the inner voices. Our most important role is to be the glue between both of them harmonically and texturally as well. Yeah.
Could we just actually listen to the first 10 bars where there's the main melody, the main first theme going, and just maybe could we just have the melody by itself first off? Cool. And now, just listening to that's going on, and the three other instruments are moving together, basically, for everything, yeah, rhythmic unison, and supporting that, just listening to the melody with that accompaniment. And it's a beautiful thing. But you know in listening to it that focus is there and these other instruments are supporting it. But what I love about music from this era is that when you go drill down into it, you actually get these really subtle differences and subtle changes. And I'm going to ask you to play another little section if you can. If you can, of course you can. If you might. If you look at bar 41, which has a first violin run up, and then this kind of new section begins. It's a really clear melodic line again from one, and the other instruments supporting. And when you get to 42, 43, 44, 45, just something slightly different happens in the way that the instruments are broken up. Can we just have from 41 to about 50-ish or thereabouts, 51? What I would love to hear is from 45, the second violin line. Just a beautiful thing. It's a counter melody, a lot of chromatic kind of movement in there. Now, can we just put that again together, just from a listening point of view of the different textural arrangement of the sounds? It's a beautiful little thing from this era. And once you know it, you hear it. And it's a beautiful, beautiful thing, especially in this era. That piece, anyone heard of sonata form? A couple of people? Yeah, right. Okay, so that piece is actually written in sonata form, which emerged from that time, from that classical era. And Basically, it's around two main themes, often contrasting, often in different keys. They're announced, they are developed, although this one, there's a lot of transition material, I think, is developed in this one, and then that returns. I'm just wondering how much, like, a structural analysis of the working of an idea actually influences you, especially in rehearsal, in putting these things together.
A great deal,
Good.
actually. So when we're looking at how we're going to choose to play the notes that are on the page, obviously we'll look at the sonata form, the exposition, the development and the recapitulation, and you would have heard that Haydn was, the way he gets back into the recapitulation, the way he gets back into that material is so clever and fun. So he's written in a lot of the pauses, but we will say, oh, we're about to come back to the beginning material. We're going to extend those pauses because we want to hold back from the audience what's going to happen. We'll take great notice of the harmony. You would have heard when it goes into a minor key, it's the inner voices that actually do that first. And so you might have noticed that we chose, when it goes into a minor key, to make the notes slightly longer to accentuate that, and that was because of the harmonic structure of the piece. In the development, you would have heard the way that we just have sort of boring, looks
Nothing's boring.
nothing's boring on the page. But when we play it together, the harmony sounds so exciting. And you would have heard that we kind of ever so slightly change the lengths of our notes to kind of ease into the tense harmonies and then the relaxed harmonies. And there's a great moment where Thibaut is, quite fiery, and he gets even more fiery. And then as the harmony becomes more relaxed and we go back into major, then he relaxes as he kind of goes up. You'll hear that he relaxes. So really, most of the decisions that we make are based on an analysis of what Haydn has written on the page.
Which is, good. Coming from an analysis kind of guy, it's just lovely to hear performers kind of going into music, working out what's meant to be happening there, and then moving to bringing that out. I've just got a final question from me, and that is, it's a more a philosophical question. In terms of, that was a piece from about 200 years ago, or over 200 years ago, and it's part, of course, of the string quartet canon, and we have great composers over the centuries who are writing for string quartet, but you as a group have been championing modern composers, commissioning works. Is that a philosophical thing on your part?
Look, definitely. It's definitely a conscious thing, and we think it's really important because playing the music of Haydn gives us a little insight into what it was like living at that time. You can read books, you can see photographs, you can watch movies even, but music gives an extra layer that you can't put into words or pictures. It gives us a sense of what it might have felt like to live then. And so if we're going to have a representation of today in music, it's really important that we make sure that music is being written so that 200 years' time, people will have an idea what was it like to live in Melbourne in 2022. And in particular for this formation, the string quartet, it's an instrument in itself, and Haydn was crucial in making sure that he set the benchmark for this ensemble. But really, I think that composers, when they come to write for the quartet, they see it as an instrument, not for individuals, but as an instrument. And I think that's where it's really important that as an instrument, we are able to play pieces of today and make sure that they're recorded and that we've got parts available so that in 200 years' time they'll still be played.
And for all the composers in the room and in the world, we thank you for that. Yeah. New music is at the heart of society, I think. Having said that, I think that's a really good introduction to our next session, where I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Tim Dargaville, who is also one of Australia's outstanding new composers, or established composers, should I say. And he's going to lead you through the next piece, which is by a modern Australian composer, as I said earlier, which was only premiered last week.
Hello, everybody. I'd like to begin by moving to Anne Corse's piece In Spaces Between, which was written in 2019. Zoe, I know you've worked with Anne very recently. She came over to Melbourne a couple of weeks ago for the premiere of the work, and I was wondering if you could perhaps tell us a little bit about what's the background to this piece.
Yeah, so this piece was written for the wonderful Zephyr Quartet, and Anne went to uni with the members of that quartet, so they had a really, really strong relationship over a number of years. This piece was written towards the end of Zephyr's life, and so it never got to be played. And there's nothing worse than a piece that sits in a drawer and doesn't exist. So
a quartet can kind of live and die.
Yes,
Is
exactly.
Okay.
So we premiered this piece in our Ascend program, and we were thrilled to discover it. It's actually a program where we choose pieces anonymously. We didn't know it was by Anne, and so it was wonderful to discover. And Anne wrote this piece when she was trying to find the spaces between all the events in her life to compose. You know, she's a working mother, she's a composer, she's a teacher. And so how do you squeeze in creativity into all of those spaces between?
And definitely Anne and her music is very much on the ascent in Australian contemporary music. She's a fantastic composer, and if you're not familiar with her music, there's an album that's been recently released, and there's a lot of terrific work out there, so I really encourage you to check out Anne Corse's music. I thought this would be a really fantastic piece to talk about classic arranges for string quartet. It's really difficult being alive in our current time because we are so past conscious. It's so easy to find out everything that's happened already and very difficult to think, well, what can you do? One of the wonderful things about Anne's piece is the way it works with some classic approaches to thinking about string quartet writing, but there are also some really interesting departures that can also happen. It's a piece that uses stillness and quiet beautifully and covers an incredible range of sounds and textures as well. So I thought what we might do is just kind of quickly step through some key moments in the piece. So when you hear it in performance, you kind of know what's happening. And let's look at these moments as sort of classic kind of examples of how you can think about working, creating ideas for quartet. So we're going to hear the very opening of the piece, which is bars 1 to 7. And essentially this is a chordal idea which really informs the structure of the whole work. So Anne calls this piece Passacaglia, and Zoe, you were telling me that the Passacaglia is kind of disguised. So if you're not familiar with the term Passacaglia comes from the Baroque era. It's a repeating cycle of music. So structures like a canon, a repetitive bass line and so on that repeats over and over in a cyclic form is what a Passacaglia is. In this piece, the repeating ideas are kind of treated differently each time. And so what we're going to focus on are the opening idea and then 4 different treatments of it to get a sense of how has it changed and what's happened to it. So our original idea, our Passacaglia, opens the piece. And as there are 3 phrases here, all the instruments play together, so it uses rhythmic unison, and it's very chordal in texture. Goodness, I love that last chord in particular. Thibaut, can I just quickly ask you, there's a beautiful sort of sound quality that Anne Corse asks for at the very beginning of the piece, which is to do with this indication of consordini, using the mute. Can you just explain what that does?
Well, the mute on the violin, well, it mutes the sound a little bit. So she's got written pianissimo consort. So if I take it off, it would... like the sound is a bit more alive, and then you mute it, and it really dampens all the overtones, so you can create a more intimate character. And then the more people you add to that intimate character, the more sort of special it becomes.
Yeah, it's a beautiful way to describe it. So if we go to the first sort of treatment of this idea, so what we've just heard is kind of the opening of the piece, and it's 3 phrases which are very chordal in texture, and then things sort of emerge and become added to this. And then this idea sort of comes back, but in some ways it's been transformed. So each time this pattern reoccurs, we get some new things built into it. So let's go to letter A and have a look at bars 28 to 40. And in this treatment, you can kind of get the sense that we're still dealing with togetherness, but there's some gentle rhythmic activity that means the instruments start to separate a little bit from each other, and we get slight differences with what's happening there. So if we can do bars 20 to 34 and hear that section. So there we've heard 2 of the phrases from the opening, and then at this point Anne does a really nifty little thing, which is let's keep people guessing about how the music's going to unfold. Rather than repeat the structure exactly, instead of the 3rd phrase, we get a little new idea that gets dropped in that's kind of in pairs. So let's hear from bars 35 for those 4 bars. It's quite a different sound. And we've still yet to hear the 3rd phrase come back. And so what Anne does at this point is kind of extend this idea a little bit, and then we arrive again at the 3rd phrase. Jenny, that nifty little trick that you just did there, could you tell us what that is and what it does?
So there's a technique called stop on the cello, which means playing with the bow close to the bridge. So instead of the normal bowing sound, it's a bit kind of steely sounding. And when it's in pianissimo, it's quite kind of chilling. The other thing that she's done, which is really interesting, is often we've got like a tremolo trill, this sort of thing. She's actually specified that it should start slowly, speed up, and then slow down again. So there's this whole, it's like a bit, I can't even do that. So. So just within that cell, there's an awful lot of information, and it's actually just this kind of whoosh of wind almost kind of through the tune.
It's a beautiful coloristic change there. So far in terms of thinking about typical approaches for writing for quartet, this piece begins with the idea of the quartet is one voice. And you were mentioning this before, thinking about the quartet as not 4 separate players, but one kind of organism. And so the first time we hear the Passacaglia, it's in this chordal texture. At this point, what we're hearing is the chords are starting to unravel a little bit through this kind of extra addition of some rhythmic ideas and some slight coloristic changes. Our next excerpt is, or next treatment of the Passacaglia is letter B. And here we get a quite different change in colour using pizzicato texture. And Zoe in particular is featured with these beautiful chords, and the harmonies are a little bit different to where the piece began. We're kind of taking some ideas from the opening and then varying it harmonically as well as timbrally. So let's hear from letter B. Thanks. So beautiful change in sound. Zoe, how do you see your part at this point? Do you see it as an accompanying bass line, or is there more of a sense of it stepping forward and leading what's happening?
Yeah, it doesn't. You wouldn't think of it as a sort of a tune if it doesn't. But I actually do see it as a tune, kind of within the pizzicatos.
Yeah, so maybe the three-note chords that you actually play, that last note up the top kind of spells out a melodic shape.
And a harmony as well, I
Yeah.
think, too, because we're just playing effectively a pedal, a three-note pedal.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's-
And you'll hear within the harmonies that we can start with minor, and then I'm going to get to major, or Anne's going to get to major. Getting to major. So in terms of, again, same as in the Haydn, the harmony will inform how you play.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So we get this sort of middle stage of the piece now where the treatment has still followed some fairly classic ideas of one instrument's featured and three other instruments sit in the background. If we think back to what Mark was explaining about the Haydn excerpt with the opening theme and the other three instruments underpinning it and playing in the gaps, here's a new version of that kind of texture at this point. Moving on to our third treatment, what we start to find now is that Anne mixes the colours between players. And so in our quartet world, we've really split into two pairs. A pizzicato pair, which are playing a sort of repetitive ostinato pattern, and that's violin 2 and the viola. And then violin 1 and the cello play arco and these sort of soaring, ascending, descending ideas in imitation with each other. Let's have a listen from bar 99 to 116. So fascinating to hear this quartet now unravel into sort of two partners that have very different sound textures. And this kind of relationship plays out through the way the music unfolds from this point. Sometimes we are together in quartet mode, sometimes we are much more separating in terms of duos, or perhaps a solo voice coming through and other voices supporting. Another version of this kind of approach we can kind of see at bar 140 to 149, so heading towards the end of the piece. Again, treatment of our opening Passacaglia, but texturally this is really different. Our partners this time, second violin and viola, are playing arco passage in a very sort of fast, rhythmic figuration. And cello and violin 1 continue on with this sort of ascending, imitating, overlapping between each other. So let's have a quick listen just to that treatment of the Passacaglia. So again, different treatment again, beautiful sound, a beautiful unfurling of these ideas. And these are approaches that you can find at all sorts of points in the string quartet repertoire. But what's wonderful is the way an individual artist can kind of make these approaches their own. I'm really excited for you to hear this piece. It's a beautiful piece and I really hope you enjoy it. So let's hear Anne Course's In Spaces Between. That was In Spaces Between, composed in 2019 by Adelaide-based composer Anne Corse, and what a beautiful piece it is, and beautifully played by Flinders Quartet. Moving into our next segment of the workshop, I feel like this is a really good question to ask at this point, which is, being a string quartet and having so much literature and repertoire over such a long period being written and played and recorded, what's it like when you see a new piece that's never been performed before and you're presenting the first performance of something that none of us has ever heard before? How do you approach playing pieces for the very first time, knowing that they've never been played or recorded?
I mean, for me personally, it's a very exciting moment to first get a score and look at it. And then with the great modern composers today, like you look at a score and you can see that there's amazing craft sort of straight away if it's quality. And we look at a piece, and in this quartet you play it and you figure out the harmony, and then it's almost as though you can kind of take more risk and have more liberty in the moment, because it's the first time you're doing something, so there's this fresh approach to the music making, which can be really, really fun.
So you're not sort of pressured by there being an existing interpretation that people might know, and
we could be pressured by having the composer in the room and being.
That's an advantage too, though.
Yeah.
But there's the good and the bad, and the good outweigh the bad, definitely.
Yeah, and composers are such a notorious lot to work with. Well, that's actually a really fascinating little insight there into thinking about how do we approach playing and understanding music for the first time when we experience it. It's interesting to think about how much of our life is spent hearing things we already know, and being in spaces we're already familiar with. And I think it's actually a really good practice to build into your life in all sorts of ways. What is it that you're doing that you haven't actually done before, whether that's to do with music or other aspects of your life? So I'm going to put my hand up and be the notorious composer in the room now, because we're going to move to a couple of short movements from an extended work for string quartet that I wrote in 2017. And the title of the work is called The Lost Pages from the Book of Memory and Forgetting. It's probably the longest title I've ever created for a piece. And there is a bit of a story to what the quartet kind of means to me, which I thought I'd give you a quick little picture of. And what we're going to do is sort of look at two movements which are essentially the same music but completely transformed. And a central creative concept for the work is this idea of something that is familiar that then disappears. And so the way that the quartet as a complete work plays this out is to take a number of very distinctly different pieces of music. The first 5 movements are very distinctly different kinds of characters and styles and moods. And then these movements come back as the next 5 movements in the work, but transformed, changed, things have happened, things aren't there anymore, and so on. And so the music kind of is replayed, but as it's being replayed, it distorts and transforms and disappears and vanishes. The idea, I guess, for this is a long backstory. So sometimes when we think about how does a composer come up with an idea, you might be thinking, oh, okay, you're in the shower and bang, there's a tune and you write it down like Mozart does, okay? I don't work that way at all. I take long times to create pieces, and it's not because I like to be slow. It's often that what a piece really is about can take many years to develop. We tend to think that art can be made quickly, and certainly there are many famous stories of white-hot creation, again thinking of Mozart and the overture to the Magic Flute being written the night before. So they say, I guess if this was Hollywood, he might have a team of copyists with him, but I don't quite know what happened in that story. But the reality is that to create an extended work particularly, we're dealing with long chunks of time and a long sort of time frame, which can often be uncertain in its trajectory. So the backstory briefly to the lost pages from the Book of Memory and Forgetting. These were originally going to be a suite of short pieces that were commissioned by a group called Ironwood, who you might have heard of, one of Australia's sort of leading string quartets in what we call the historically informed performance area. And Ironwood play a lot of traditional repertoire, but often research techniques from the eras of the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries and give performances of works from the repertoire on gut strings and in different tunings and so on. So this is an ensemble that has a very particular approach in terms of what they do. And so when they asked me to create new pieces for them, this was the landscape that they kind of gave me. Some pieces that in a sense could sit alongside the table music of the 16th century, where people would sit around a table and play viola da gamba, and there'd be books printed of music, which essentially was kind of multi-layered and very polyphonic. At the time that they approached me, and this is in 2009, my mother Rosemary was in the space of moving through dementia. And I guess many of us can relate to this situation. You may have friends or parents or elders in your life who are dealing with what happens when you can't do things that you would normally expect to be able to do. And so in beginning this work, I was also her carer, along with my brother and my sister. And over the next 6-7 years, in a sense, as often happens in these situations, my mother kind of disappeared. And that story also ran alongside the creation of this string quartet, which at that point wasn't intended to be an 11-movement work going for 25 minutes, which is now what it is. It was just a series of short little fragments for string quartet. After Rosemary died in 2013, these little fragments never really kind of came to any sort of sense of fruition. And it took some years before I really understood that what I wanted to do with the piece was take these initial pieces and transform them and have them disappear. Because I found being with my mother in that space was profoundly moving. It's not something we like to talk about very much. And it's something that we tend to shy away from, this idea that being a person can mean that you can disappear and that people around you can see this happen, and often it's a very confronting thing. So I wanted to create a piece of music that could allow us to be in that space, but in a way where we could feel good about it, rather than feel like it's something that freaks us out and that we don't want to think about it. I think it's important that we do think about it. And one of the things that I'm very interested in as a composer is how we deal with life and how music can reflect that. So I came up with this design of the piece, which I mentioned briefly, which was to say of the 11 movements, the first 5 are very distinctly different, and they all reference different sorts of approaches and styles. My mum was a great lover of the string quartet, and so in some respects I was kind of talking to her. Okay, Mum, what kind of music would you like to hear for the 3rd movement? I'll make you something like that. Okay, so we're going to go to the 5th movement, which is the central movement, and this is the piece which is deliberately written in a style that I know my mum would have loved. And it very much references the world of the late 19th century. You can probably think of a whole bunch of names. I'm not going to tell you because I didn't really have a particular composer or a particular piece in mind. I just thought, what's the kind of music that I can imagine my mum really enjoying listening to, and starting from that point. So we're going to hear just a short excerpt from the 5th movement, and then we're going to have a look at what happens later on in the piece in relation to the 10th movement, and then you'll hear both movements side by side so you can get a sense of the overall there. Interesting planning this workshop for today and realising, well, when I look at the 5th movement, I'm doing a Haydn here. And what we hear in the arrangement of the parts is something similar, where violin 1 kind of leads the story and violin 2, viola and cello are working together in rhythmic unison, but you'll hear the music here is a lot slower. So they're still underpinning and playing in the gaps as they do in the Haydn piece, but of course it feels quite different. So let's hear Bach's, the opening excerpt of movement number 5. So this is how the movement begins. You can see from the printed material that you've got there in front of you that there's not really a lot of indication about dynamics. And I'm interested to find out, given that you've not played this before, so we're kind of at our first meeting and I'm being notorious composer and they're going, oh, the composer's in the room, what are we going to do? Let's be nice. Okay. So interesting to now having heard you play it. What are you actually doing with the dynamics there rather than what have I notated there?
Mm-hmm. I think... so what we've got, do you have this in front of you? No. Yes.
Yeah, yes.
So we have a marking tenderly, and then we have dynamics. So Thibaut is a dynamic level above the rest of us. So yeah. we're essentially the left hand of a piano chord. But I think within that mezzo piano, like we were in the Haydn, we're really kind of leaning into the beautiful harmonic changes that happen. There are a lot of clashes between, there are little semitones that pass in and out of each other, and we tend to kind of lean into those bits. So we're not necessarily sticking completely to what's written, but with that in mind, I think the three of us are always conscious that Thibaut is the tune and we're accompanying.
Yep.
So it's kind of breathing in and out with what we hear.
And that is very much like Haydn doesn't give us much information either. Sometimes you can go for a whole page without having a dynamic marking, and that gives us a freedom to sort of to explore what the notes on the page mean to us individually. Because I think the best thing is that a piece is different depending on who's playing it some composers would like it to be exactly the same every time, but on other occasions, having that freedom actually makes the piece live every single time.
There's another beautiful thing in the writing for the bottom three players. And you see the first, at the end of the first bar into the second bar, it's the same note, but reiterated, but under a slur. If we just played those with separate bows, that's the kind of sound you get. But because it's kind of under the same bow, there's this sort of resistance and tugging feeling that we have. It's a little bit more...
There's a bit of a struggle.
Hard, yeah. Which it's just one tiny thing, but it just makes such a big difference.
Yes,
Oh, isn't that interesting to you? I had actually absolutely no idea about that being the impact. And here's the interesting conundrum. You see, I don't play a string instrument. I'm a pianist by training. And so I'm imagining how you might approach it as a player, but there's so much that I literally do not know that, in a sense, the art of notating music for me is about saying, well, if I put just enough there, what will emerge? And I really very much love the way you described, Jenny, this idea of breathing, because that was something that was very much in my mind with these slow chords as they move, is this sense of there is an ebb and flow, but I don't know that you can actually notate that. You could over-notate it and make people read very hard but not actually listen to what they're playing. Or you could allow for it to just emerge, and it might emerge differently in each performance. And for me, that's actually a wonderful thing. Yeah.
It's good that when things like this aren't overmarked, actually, because it gives us a sense of freedom, and it also allows us to interpret it our own way, according to the mechanics of our instruments as well. So, nice.
So, and this is one of the challenges with creating new music, is that it's often very rare that you can get to actually work in this kind of situation. This is kind of a golden moment for both performers and composers. It's very hard to actually maintain this on a regular basis. And so there's a lot of imagining that goes on where you're going, cross fingers and hope this is going to work out, and we'll sort it out in the 5 minutes before the premiere kind of situation. Well, not really. It's great when a piece does have a long development period, and this work, The Lost Pages, did have that. So there's been a lot of time in allowing things to mature. When I was writing the piece, I thought, gee, wouldn't it be fabulous if you could just snap your fingers and there's the quartet in your room by your piano, and you can just go, okay, can you guys just do this now so I can get a sense of whether this is going to work or not? So I thought this, given that we are in the same room, let's try something like this. The idea for me at the time was, having made something, how can this thing vanish? This was kind of the creative concept, if you like. So I thought it might be fun to take just a few bars from the middle of this fifth movement and look at the role that tone colour plays with string instruments, because this is an enormous area of fascination, and particularly so for recent compositions going back in the 20th century. The idea of the string quartet not only playing just with the bow or just playing the plucked string, but having a whole range of colours available to this ensemble is something that a lot more recent music has explored. And likewise, I've got an interest in that as well. So if we cut to the bridge, as James Brown might say in the fifth movement. So again, we're following the idea of there's a slow-moving, very decorated melody line in the first violin, and the accompaniment, which is very much in rhythmic unison. What I'd like to do is just focus on the accompaniment and from a coloristic point of view, and think about how can we sort of play around and transform this. So if we go from, is that letter B that I can see there's something? Yep. So if we can just do 4 bars from letter B, just hearing the lower parts in the piece. And so on from there. So in its original, and in the way that it's written in the fifth movement, it's a very plain kind of passage, if you like. But I'd be interested to hear suggestions from you guys about, okay, if we were wanting to make this become more vulnerable, more fragile, disappear, what kinds of techniques might you think about or suggest to a composer to say, well, okay, here's something that would distort the sound or whatever from there? What kind of suggestions do you think?
We could certainly try it without. So we kind of automatically had vibrato, and we're playing it quite fully as a mezzo piano. We could probably try it without the vibrato and with either more or less bow. You can either get a more condensed sound if you use less bow, or quite if we're not using vibrato, a kind of steely, floaty kind of sound.
And if we put a mute in as well, that would also kind of...
Yeah, that would change the tone.
Yeah, well, let's try that.
Should we try it with a bit more bow?
Yeah,
Yeah.
as much as possible.
Yeah, it's interesting the way it makes the sound less... I'm just speaking, just hearing it for the first time going, it's more contained. So there's a different... this is where English is terrible. I'm feeling like Roberto Benigni. My English is a tragedy at the moment. But this is what happens, you see, when you're in this kind of creative exchange, is that we often move into the non-verbal space with music. And I noticed this working with musicians where you're thinking as an ensemble, and rather than try and explain in a paragraph how to get from here to here, it might just be a movement where you go like that. So this is what can happen. You're finding that you're processing a lot of information, but you're not necessarily clear about where that's going. This also happens in the writing process. I began this work as a series of short pieces, might only be 6 3-minute movements. What in the end emerged was a 25-minute major kind of extended work. I didn't know that that's what was going to come out at the end. So we're dealing with the unknown here a little bit. I do like this kind of sound, but I'm thinking I want to dirty it up a little bit more. So if I can throw something back to you a little bit and say, can we hear that again with perhaps with the mutes off, but this time much closer to the bridge, say with sul ponticello. So it's a much more kind of distorted sound. Yeah? Yeah, okay, so it's it's much more sort of glassy sort of texture, and interesting how it sort of separates the three of you a little more in terms of, rather than feeling like a unit, we're getting different sort of qualities of this kind of shiny texture. Thibaut, can I jump to you and suggest what else might kind of distort or fragment, or what kinds of string approaches with a texture like this would you say, well, you could push it even further and do something like this, for instance?
Well, I guess you could sort of experiment with maybe some tremolo or something further like that.
Yeah.
Or even start having different players do different things.
Okay. Right.
So there could be that beautiful first bit, but with one player just being that real sul pont can create some sort of real intent.
Okay, so which part do you think would be best to go to, say, let's go you sul pont and you can be a little different and the other two to be the same? What would you reckon?
I feel like Tom's part's the most painful
active,
harmonically.
Yeah.
Maybe you could be the steely
Yeah.
quality in the middle.
Yeah.
Okay, so more sul pont on viola and cello and second violin are less so?
Could try.
Perhaps.
Something to try. It might
Why
not
not?
work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Excellent, let's try it.
I'm confused. What am I doing?
Normal.
We're just
I'm normal.
Oh,
But keep it non-vib.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Might transition out of it here.
Okay. I love the look on your face there, Tibor, going, yeah, maybe not such a good
the harmony
idea.
is so nice when the three are the same.
Yeah.
So, but it is interesting, like, because then that sort of highlighted Tom's part. But then we have to remember that there's still my part on top.
I know, but I feel like I'm going to undo this thing now and actually say, so Tom, can we do this one again?
Yeah.
And in addition to playing sulpont, can you tremolo?
Yeah.
So what we're now doing is we really are kind of distorting what was originally there, if that makes sense. So rather than having this sort of even trio, very tightly bound harmonic structure, we're going, no, let's split it. All right, so let's try it again.
And one further again, I mean, you know, we can keep the tenuto markings so each note is
Articulated,
re-articulated.
spoken.
Okay.
Or we can have a continuous tremolo where there's no sort of distinct re-articulation between the notes. Which one would you prefer?
Your call.
All right, we'll try the first one.
Right. You know what? I really like that.
Yeah.
I think I might write it in. So what does that mean about the history of the quartet repertoire, folks? Where do the good ideas really come from? One wonders.
Could I give you another idea, Tim?
You
Which
can.
is just in
I
terms
just
of
might check in with my good colleagues about how are we going for time.
17 minutes.
We're good for time. Okay, great. We can extend this. Right.
I like what you were talking about in terms of fragile and losing things, and I love the vulnerability of the sound. And one thing that you can do is actually some artificial harmonics, which it takes us up a couple of octaves, and it makes it really kind of it'll probably put us up higher than Thibaut in register.
So if all three?
Or
Ooh.
one of all
I'm
three of us. I
excited
mean,
about
if you're
this.
willing to try artificial harmonics, Tom.
Yeah.
On the same note?
So the
Could I hear
Does that take you
you?
up?
Could I hear you all do harmonics?
does
Yeah.
it
That
take you
kind of
up
thing?
exactly 2 octaves?
Yeah.
Yeah, 2 octaves.
Yeah, great.
Yes. Much more technically challenging.
Yeah. But Absolutely fascinating to hear. It's like you've come from another universe as an ensemble. That's quite special. Thank you for that. I think maybe what we should do is let's hear now both the fifth movement and what became the 10th movement, which is essentially a replay of the fifth movement, but looking at some of these kind of questions about how to dissolve sound and thinking coloristically. One of the key things that happened as I wrote the piece was I realised not only did I want the music to dissolve, but I also wanted the group to dissolve. And so as the music unfolds, at certain points, each player will leave the group and play from a more distant position. So one of the things that you'll see as we play through both movements is the fifth movement is conceived for a quartet playing in this classic formation, playing together seated. And when we go to the 10th movement, you'll see that 3 of the players have been actually spread out and playing from a more remote position. And so you're kind of seeing this in fast forward version. In the full work, this happens over time with one player leaving at a time. But what we'll see today is the close version and then the more distant version, if that makes sense. So I'll hand over to Flinders Quartet and we're going to hear movement number 5 from my work, The Lost Pages from the Book of Memory and Forgetting.
was, again, the fantastically wonderful Flinders Quartet and this man next to me, Dr. Tim Dargaville, his piece. One more round of applause. We just thought we'd open, we've got about 5 minutes or so. If anyone actually has any questions that you'd like to ask either the quartet or Tim himself as the composer of that last piece, show up your hand and we'll get a mic to you. Young gentleman over there.
Hello. I think I have two questions, one for each. I just noticed as the group playing, your sort of as you work together to perform your pieces, you're breathing as a group, which I think is quite similar to, I've played in a wind band, so I kind of can relate to that and notice that a little bit. So where does that, in your rehearsals, and where does that sort of come from, that, and as you're kind of learning to work together more as a group, does that sort of stem from that, that sort of cooperation?
Do you know what's really interesting is that we recently played a piece by Katie Abbott, and she actually wrote into the piece an audible breath in. And it was fascinating when we were rehearsing that, actually went, wow, that's really naturally. Then the next note was together. And of course it's something that we talk about in terms of how we're going to move together, how we're going to breathe together. Before you play, it's really important what happens beforehand. To be perfectly honest, it's something that happens very organically and naturally. Actually, as we might talk about it consciously a few times. I think there was a moment at the beginning of Tim's piece where Jenny this morning said, look, I'm going to breathe a quaver, so we knew that what Jenny was thinking so that we could come in together. But in actual fact, we like to learn from wind band people in terms of how to breathe.
But we normally breathe in the tempo. It's like the lead, and if it comes from me or whoever, then that's the easiest thing to follow, because just doing this, there's like, you can't really tell when the note starts. But if it's the bar and it's sort of physical, then we can really do it together.
It's a technical thing too, a mechanical thing. It really helps place the bow, especially in slow movements like this. If you're holding your breath, I don't know, I'll get bow shakes for a start. But yeah, it really helps to just place the bow, and as these guys have both said, just to play together. So yeah.
Second question?
Yeah, awesome. So the second question for the composer, when you sort of decide to have the players move their positions and sit somewhere else, you've explained where that idea came from. Do you work out where they sit? Is that written in the score, and how do you sort of communicate that to the players and how that will affect the music?
That's a great question, because it does come back to this thing about how much do you write in and how much do you let a group take your piece and shape it in their own way. So in the score there's a note that from movement number 6, the first one of the violinists will leave the group and go to a position more remote. And I don't specify exactly where that might be because you don't know what venue the piece will be played in, but there is a note in the score that says when all players have moved, it's still really important that they feel connected, so that there's still eye contact, so that there's a sense of they're able to see and hear each other. So the piece has been played in a number of different venues, and each time the solution has been different. But I've let the group work that out. It's kind of really very much about what the group feels comfortable with. Some groups have tried great distances and others have been more closer together. And sometimes it's determined by the architecture of the space.
Or technical limitations.
Exactly. Yeah, this was probably the closest version of movement number 10 that I've heard. We've actually had, we filmed the work in a massive storage facility in Sydney called Dangrove. And you can see a film of that on YouTube, and it's in this huge cavernous building like a contemporary medieval cathedral, and there's great distance between the players and all these interesting sculptures in between. So I do like groups to play with it, but there are some caveats around that which are to do with make sure you can see and hear each other so that the piece doesn't fall apart. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome, thank you.
Any other questions?
I'm interested in ensemble dynamics and how it changes from performance to performance, whether instrumental roles have been established over traditional lines and expectations for that instrument, or whether individual personalities are able to articulate new ways of interacting and expressing and bringing out more colour and texture in the music.
Where do we start?
That's a really fascinating question, and I think historically, having the first violin is as the leader and the person who decides everything. I think that each, not necessarily the way that we work, although we always listen when Thibaut says something.
Well, I mean, in a quartet, like, every voice is equal. Like, we're saying in the Haydn that my part is more important, but, like, without Tom's part, like, it doesn't work, it doesn't make sense. And, like, for me, like, playing the melody, I need to be dictated by the inner voices a bit, because they sort of, you help show where the phrasing goes. Like, the harmony of those parts is so important for me to understand what was going on. And like with Tim's piece, when we were doing the experimentation, the way you guys ended up playing, like whether it's harmonics or sul-pont, greatly affects what I'm able to do. So if you decide to do that, then I don't have a choice. And that could be a risk that happens in the moment on stage, and then we just have to trust that we are professional and we're listening. Yeah, we're listening and we're doing our thing. Or, we have to make the decision beforehand. And maybe I don't like it. Sometimes there has to be compromise. But I don't know, we've been playing in a quartet for a long time, and these compromises happen like with enough ease that it's a good experience.
It probably varies greatly from quartet to quartet as well, I would say.
And one thing that's interesting is that Jenny and Tom are actually, they're guesting in today for Wilma and Helen, and we know them really well, and we've played with them on a number of occasions. But for instance, the Haydn was subtly different to how we play it with Wilma and Helen. Yeah. And Anne's piece, subtly different to how we play it with Wilma and Helen. And it's exciting just to sort of trust when you've got musicians that they bring something a little bit different. And even from performance to performance, I think one of the most exciting things is walking on stage and trusting that we've had the conversations that need to have been had, and that if somebody in that spur of the moment has a flash of inspiration and decides to take the music differently, they can. Thibaut, quite consciously in the Haydn, has not decided what he's going to do in certain bars, and that keeps us on our toes, make sure that we're listening.
I think we might have just run out of time for the minute, so I'm going to stop you there, Tim. You were going to say something,
That's all right.
Look, I'd just really like to wrap up and do the thank yous. To the staff at the Melbourne Recital Centre, specifically Belinda, who's been our contact and guru, and Bennett, I'm going to run through every name. Bennett, Matt, John, Jan, Alex, Caitlin, Jenny and Ebony for their work today. I'm contractually obliged to thank Fiona Webster and the executive team at Virtual School Victoria for supporting this partnership. Some people will understand that. I'd really like to thank this man next to me, Dr. Tim Dargaville, for the wealth of his creative insights, and especially Thibaut, Jenny, Tom and Zoe from the fabulously wonderful Flinders Quartet. Thank you.
Thank you.
And like any good MC, what I did yesterday was to Google quotes about string quartets. And I'd like to leave you with this one, and it's from Geoffrey Tate, English conductor who died about 3 or 4 years ago now, I think. And just think about this, all right? The most perfect expression of human behaviour is a string quartet. Thank you.